Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight for our first Talks on Tap for 2020. Our theme this year is Facing Ourselves, Discussions on Civil Discourse. It's a phrase that many of you have probably heard before, and I'm glad that you're here to be a part of this discussion. I think this will be a great discussion for our community. As we were thinking about what to do for the series this year, looking at the climate in our country, the culture, and what's going on with it being an election year, we decided this was a pretty timely conversation to have. So I'm going to start out here just with, I'm going to read you a few statements and to get us into the mind frame of thinking about civil discourse and thinking about ourselves and how we talk to each other. So just, is there something for you to think about as I read through them? Think about yourself. So true or false? When a conversation gets heated, I contribute to the conversation. And if you answered true to that statement, would people say you typically are an inflamer, an informer, an inquirer, an influencer, a good listener, or a comedian? Right? True or false? When peers disagree about an issue, I remain silent. If you answered true to that statement, why do you tend to remain silent? Can that be a good thing? And what makes you comfortable enough to speak? I take an active role in creating a welcoming environment for differing opinions. If you answered true, what specifically do you say or do that creates that welcoming environment? And if you answered false, what could you do? And I give my peers eye contact and full attention when they speak, even when I disagree. How does it make you feel when others do the same for you? And does it make a difference in the conversation that you have? So, as you're thinking about those things, let me introduce to you our speaker for tonight. We have Lara Schwartz. She is the project director for the Project on Civil Discourse at American University in Washington, D.C. She founded and directs the Project on Civil Discourse. She specializes in discourse and campus speech, constitutional law, civil rights, politics, communications, and policy. Drawing on her extensive experience as a legislative lawyer, lobbyist, and communication strategist in leading civil rights organizations, she brings an advocate's eye view to her work. Currently, she is a fellow at the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, and she is a co-author of How to College, What to Know Before You Go and When You're There. Lara came to teaching from a career in advocacy. She served as Director of Strategic Engagement at the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy, where she focused on access to the civil justice system and judicial nominations advocacy. As Courts Matter Director at Media Matters, she identified and corrected misinformation about the legal system. As Vice President of External Affairs at the American Association of People with Disabilities, she engaged with media, Congress, and the executive branch in advocating for workplace protections and health care. She was legal director at the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest civil rights group advocating for LGBTQ community. There, she promoted hate crimes legislation, financial protections for families, workplace protections, and equality in military service. So I am proud to introduce to you Lara Schwartz.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. It is impossible to compete with the view in this building, and I actually don't want to compete with the view. If you feel like sort of reflecting, closing your eyes, looking at the river, these things, motivate you, that's great. So this is a nice enough size crowd that I think now that you know who I am, we actually have the time and space to introduce you to. So what I'd like to start with, if we could start with this gentleman here, if you would just say your name, maybe where you're from. And I like to always do one question during introductions. And so my question is, how many jelly beans can this room hold? So why don't we start with you?
See, that's what I get for sitting in front.
Right. That's why my students know not to sit in the front. The guys who are going to college next year can sit in front.
My name is Doug Babb. I'm the chairman of the United States Marshals Museum, and we are so grateful to have you here. This is a wonderful topic at a critical time, and it doesn't matter where I'm from. This is my hometown.
And the jelly beans, sir?
1,356,000.
Very authoritative.
You want to know.
Who are you, and how many jelly beans can this room hold, and any other data point you think this group should have?
I'm Bill Ingalls, and we got a good start in this group of jelly beans, but I'd say there's 16,842,000.
I'm Tommy Sams, retired from 16 billion.
My name's Keith Law, and I'm the city director at Fort Smith, and I'm a native to Fort Smith, and I have no clue how many jelly beans this room will hold.
Hi, I'm Christina Olson, and I will say 1 billion.
Doug Olson, originally from Columbus, Ohio, live here in Fort Smith now, and I'll go with 10,035,000.
I'm Jill Cox, I'm originally from here, and more than one.
I'm Will Cox. I'm from a small town of Dayton, Missouri, but I've been in Fort Smith for about 15 years. I think it's like 50 billion.
Passionate, park ranger at the Fort Smith National Historic Site. And I'm thinking jelly bellies, so they're the little jelly beans. 1.57 trillion.
Jill Carson, and tonight I'm teaching at the university and a professor out there, and my class is very happy because I just was early to come here. And I'm thinking that it would be the GDP of several of a country.
Bill Rogers, large range in Fort Smith, live and pay here, more than I can afford.
George Steve, born and raised in Fort Smith, several decades.
I'm Stanley Rest. I'm a recruiter for the 2020 U.S. Census. I'm also president of Temple Shalom in Fayetteville, and I think one infinitely expanding television.
Do the people in this room need to know anything about the census since we have their attention?
Well, someone was wearing a button. A lot of people got bottles, but the census is upon us, and we're trying to hire about 20 more people in Smith and County at $17 an hour.
Right, okay.
Matt Hall, I've been here in Fort Smith about 6.5 years. I'm a damn Yankee. I don't want to go back up north. It's too cold. I would say jelly beans, 64 million.
Hi, I'm Micah Alt, live here in Fort Smith. I would say 3 trillion jelly beans.
I'm Tristan Alberson. I'm a Southside senior, and my AP class has never taught me how many jelly beans would fill up the room, but I'd go with 300 million.
I'm Matthew Alt, I'm also a senior at Southside High School, and looking at the size of this room, I would say 15.8 million.
My name's Greg Hall. I'm born and raised in Fort Smith. Now I live in Dayton here. And I say, let's go get jelly beans in the city.
We call that experiential learning in my field.
Greg Van, I'm from Fort Smith and retired. 500 million.
I'm Betty Van, and he didn't say we're Okies from Muskogee, both of us. And this is our second time in Fort Smith. We like it, we love it. And I think there might be about 55 million.
I accidentally drove to Oklahoma yesterday, had a nice time. So, we relate now.
Susan Lewis, and I'm from Fort Smith, and I'd say
I'm Pat Shaw, Fort Smith, and I'm retired. I would guess about $3 billion.
I'm Kristen C. Rambo, and I'm a voice nurse, and I'm going to say $15 million.
Gwendolyn Brad at Fort Smith, and I would say about $10 billion.
Bob Canada, Fort Smith, originally from Woodward County, Oklahoma, and more than I can eat.
Charlotte Tidwell, Fort Smith, member of the Marshals Museum Board. I lose every time I gamble.
My name is Gennaro Cabrera, Fort Smith since '91. Before I lived in Van Nuys, California, and I don't gamble.
I'm Julie Weeks. I'm a bookkeeper here in Fort Smith, and I live in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And I have no idea.
Libby Meyer, I'm from Fort Smith, Arkansas. I'm proud to have you in here, and I would say $1 trillion.
I'm Larry Meyer, here from Fort Smith, retired. And I have it on good faith that Patrick does not want this room filled with
He's thinking about the carpeting and like sweating right now.
Scott McCollum, I'm actually just here running sound tonight, but I'm excited to listen. And from Fort Smith, Arkansas, and however many jelly beans it will hold is the amount that would make my kids really happy.
I'm Chris Bader. I work for U.S. Representative Steve Womack, head of his district office here in Fort Smith. Very excited to learn about this thing called Civil Discourse. It's important, especially in my line of work. And I'm going to take my guess on the number of jelly beans, inspiration from this census guy over here, and say 330 million.
Do you have cards on you in case any of your neighbors here need to talk to your boss? Okay. Wow, I'm just saying, civic engagement. Yeah.
Drew Smith, Times Record. I actually just finished my master's at AU.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so moved here about 2 months ago. And I'm going to say the equivalent of the national debt.
I'm just kind of mind blown because it means that the number will increase during this speech. So.
Hi, I'm Michelle Schmitz. I'm a teacher and I live in Fort Smith, and I think about 1 billion jelly beans.
Thank you, teacher.
I'm Kelly Schmitz of Fort Smith. I'm going to say 2 billion.
Dave Kennedy, I'm a curator here at the museum, and I know way too much about this building, and so everybody's numbers are way low.
I'm Patrick Weeks, and yeah, I think the jelly beans coming in here. But to fill it, I don't know, I guess I'd just say one really, really big one.
I'm Alice L. I'm also with the Marshals Museum Foundation, and I'm going to kind of piggyback on my friend who said this, we're here somewhere, as many as it takes, +1 to fill the room.
I'm Leslie Higgins. Didn't do your introduction. I'm the Director of Education. I don't think I said that. But Dave showed me his answer, so I don't have a fair answer. My name is Jennifer C. Rambo. I'm also a member of the United States Marshals Museum Foundation. And I'm going to guess 21 trillion. Ooh. I'm Tracy Jacobs with the museum. And I'm going to guess it's probably as many as I've put on my desk for all these people.
Thank you for your service as that person in the office with the canteen.
Jericho Frazier, originally from Conway, but lived in Fort Smith for 5 years. I'm a senior at a global campus, which is why I'm here for my multimedia journalism class. I don't know how many jelly beans it takes to fill the room, but I'm pretty sure if you guys want to try it, I can fill it and do it.
I'm sorry, what did you say your name was?
Jericho.
And one last person?
I'm Jamie Mitchell from the Times Record. I'm a photographer, and I was born in Muskogee and lived here since 1963.
So I don't have prizes, but I actually know the correct answer. Tommy, Julia, and Jarek got it right. It was, I don't know. Right? I don't know is the hardest thing in the world to say in front of other people. It's even harder than I was wrong. Because when you say I was wrong, you're kind of taking control of the situation. You know, we have this illusion of control, and we say we're wrong. It means I've learned something. I might get my way out of the doghouse by admitting this. There's a degree of, you know, it's less vulnerable to say I was wrong than to say I don't know. So I asked that question for a few reasons. Primarily, I'm a pain. Secondarily and tertiarily, it can draw out a couple of things. One is that we're quite disinclined to say I don't know in front of one another. And I'm going to posit in the course of this talk that that's something we can work on together, all of us. It's weird going around the country being like, you know, I'm an expert in humility. It does not work. So, but a degree of humility can be helpful, and there are limits. Another reason is I think this works best. If we're talking discourse, we should talk together rather than me sort of blasting words out of my face at your faces. It's not very much fun. There's beer, there's popcorn, there's sunset, we're together. And lastly, because one of the things that I've found, how many of you do in your workplace or anywhere you are, you do the like go around the room and ask a question kind of intro thing ever? Is that an exercise you've done before? So I do that a lot. One of the things that I notice, and I like noticing stuff about how people talk because that's what my work's about. One of the things I notice is that people listen to the answers that come out in these exercises. Do you notice this? And a culture will kind of develop in a room where if a trend picks up, people start treating it like it's mandatory almost. So I noticed this. I was doing a training for student leaders at American University where I teach. And I asked, like, you know, give me your name, your hometown, your year in school, and I don't know, some fact. What's your favorite cereal? You know, something like that. And what ended up happening was people started taking, and partly I was a bit of an authority figure. I was a professor visiting another professor's class, and I was leading the class. So when the person asks, they often have some kind of authoritative role. Although, right, you all can leave, you can yell, she's not very clever, you can do all manner of things. I don't hold any authority, but I'm standing here in the front, and the way it's set up, it was supposed to be me saying stuff and you being dazzled. And so if I fall off, that'll be fun. But what I noticed in that space was once someone started running with the cereal thing, it started becoming like a rule of this little society that had formed like 5 minutes before, the society of me being added to their class. And so it was getting to the point of absurdity where you had students who were like gluten intolerant or sugar intolerant being like apologizing for not having a favorite cereal, you know, and being like, well, you know, cereal would literally kill me, but I've often admired the Lucky Charms leprechaun's pluck and spirit. And you're like, you never had to say that you liked a cereal, but it becomes the culture of a place, and that's called a norm. So every little community develops its norms, and the norm that developed in this community, even though Tommy was bravely correct early on, so I don't know, I don't have any idea. The norm that developed in this community was to give it a go and try and use lots of interesting intellectual approaches, you know. One big jelly bean that's room-sized would work. I like the gambling approach of like, it's definitely more than one. That works better when you're the only person betting, but it's still not bad for the risk averse. But our little culture of this society that we pulled together a few minutes ago was one where you venture a guess and try. And some people even overlaid a bit of expertise on it. I know a few things. I have some credibility because, you know, I know a bit about the building, or I know it's more than this certain amount. So it's an interesting thing to note because there wasn't really a right way to do the exercise. The right answer is I don't know, but there wasn't really a right way to do the exercise, but we're going to generally start going along with the way others are communicating in our community. We're going to observe norms. And those norms generally don't really have moral weight, right? It's not that the good people among us guessed high and specific numbers and the evil-hearted ones among us, I'm looking at you, were less specific, anything like that. We developed a habit very quickly and we kind of ran with it. And I think, we've been invited to be reflective about how we are as communicators. The first thing to reflect upon is in the communication contexts where you might be, work, home, your primary, relationship, your relationship with kids, your relationship with the people you work with or for. What are the norms people observe? Where do they come from? And where on earth might they have come from? We do a lot of because we always did it that way kind of things. I'm going to pan back from that little exercise and tell you some big ideas and then hopefully get into a discussion where the things that are on your mind, whatever drew you here, apart from the beer, which is, legitimate, that we can spend some time doing that together. But what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the ideas that I've generated over time when it comes to productive discourse. So, when do I get to start swearing? Is that allowed in here? Can I just drop an F-bomb?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, he says no. Why can't I?
You can do anything you please.
Well, I can, so I have the right to. But, to quote the great philosopher, Dr. Ian Malcolm, from the fine cinematic epic Jurassic Park, because I'm really fancy, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. So I probably shouldn't, you suppose. Why shouldn't I just drop an F-bomb? I know it's only Monday, but aren't we just feel nice? Why shouldn't I?
It doesn't sound like civil discourse.
It sounds uncivil. Why does it sound uncivil?
Because it's brash.
It's brash. Okay, so it's the Lions, right? Your alma mater?
Yes.
Oh, your favorite. Okay, so that's Razorbacks. Razorbacks. Do we have partisan affiliation in here? Razorbacks or Lions? What are we? Okay, so Lions. F yeah. F yeah, like to the skies. Is that uncivil?
For some people it would be because of past experience they have with the F word brings back different experiences.
Right, so maybe for some people it could have
a negative connotation.
Negative connotation. Much of the time, that word is completely untethered from whether a person is being kind or unkind. So I know I've met three young men who are in high school. Do you all, I won't tell you your mom, she's right there, she knows. Do you all ever use that word to affirm one another's excellence, like when Matt got his recognition for the Air Force Academy, sort of F yeah?
Yes, they do.
Is lying civil, gentlemen? Do you ever just affirm one another like, oh yeah, you did it great, except the whole word? You do, right? Some of the rest of us do too. So it's possible to be really kind while dropping that word, Do you think I can get into Georgetown? F yeah, right? I was talking to them earlier, they seem really bright and cool. But it's a rule, it's a norm, right, that we don't use that word in a space like this. And that norm might actually exclude people in a way that might feel unkind. There might be people for whom keeping control of what they say is hard for them. and they might keep themselves out of spaces like this because words fly out of their mouth because of their disability, because of who they are, maybe because of the way that they were educated or the way in which they grew up. Do you think we can kind of agree that profanity is one of those rules that, like, it's more of a norm, right? It's not enforceable. As our friend said, we can't really stop me from doing it. As my students know, I'm the cool teacher who swears. That's my lane. So it's a norm. It's not a rule. And it's one that's like maybe not so completely related to, for instance, justice or kindness. Like you could be, let's say, a US Marshal, pursue justice and do your job great, and have a potty mouth, right? Do any of you have a friend who's like ride or die, but their language is not grandma appropriate? Or maybe you have a grandma who's like ride or die and her language isn't museum appropriate. So I'm often asked to talk about, so I do an F civility talk that I bring to high schools, and it really scares the teachers, which is a little fun. Because I'm like, hey, anybody want to talk about the F-bomb? And they're like, oh, we can't, but we kind of want to. And if she says we can, is that going to be the rule in here? Does she have the authority to break that rule? And I have the right, but I wouldn't. The norm of messing with what a teacher is trying to accomplish in her classroom is like not cool, don't do it, you know? But I'm asked to talk about two basic topics when I'm invited places. One is what we call freedom of speech, constitutional right, originating in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and some similar amendments to state constitutions. And what we call civil debate. And when I'm invited to do those things, I generally say, you know, that's not what I really want to do. Because neither of those things, as I see it, has much to say about what speech is actually about. And what I would posit speech is actually about, and discourse is actually about, is governing ourselves in our mutual interest. Why do we have freedom of speech? Well, one reason is we actually don't trust government to decide what's okay to say, right? And another is we're supposed to be able to govern ourselves. I was asked to talk in the context of this being an election year. What is the choice to vote? We are deciding how we wish to govern ourselves, and it is we the people who govern. So the thing about the First Amendment as a topic that's not worth flying me in here to talk about is that all it is a limitation on government authority. It's not a blueprint for how to live. It doesn't tell us how to find truth. It doesn't tell us how to speak truth. It doesn't tell us we must be kind, can be kind, that we must be truthful. It doesn't tell us how to reach agreements with the people we have to work alongside of and live alongside of in our communities. All it does is tell authority figures to stay the F out of it. And it leaves the rest up to us. So talking about your freedom, you know, you're free to try to generate a dinosaur that will eat everybody in here, right? But hopefully you've thought about whether you should. So I don't really like giving a free speech. And civility, this idea of formality, manners, the rules of what you're allowed to say, magic words like the F word. And again, I would say you can find a better word than the F word to celebrate when your best friend does something amazing, or you find out that your biopsy's negative, or the Razorbacks win something. Like, go ahead and email me that word, but the F word is a great word, you know, F, yeah, is great. Civility, this idea of following the rules that people have made up over time of how we engage with one another, kind of our informal, unenforceable expectations. I find that if we focus too much on it, we'll fall into the trap of being more devoted to order than to justice. Does anybody recognize that quotation, more devoted to order than to justice? Where does that come from? It's a letter from Birmingham Joe. So it's King saying moderates, he was frustrated with moderates being more devoted to order than to justice. Because order says you don't sit at a lunch counter where the business owner has the legal right to exclude you and has asked you to leave. And the people in the community are saying they want you to leave. That's order. That's the norms, even the rules. It's not justice. So I think, profanity is one of the rules that's unrelated to kindness or justice. And civility is formalistic. It's also only about the people at the table. And I'll talk a little bit about this, but I find that the concepts of just basic formalized manners sometimes involve creating accommodations that exclude. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So what I'm going to talk about instead is that both rules, which are enforceable guaranteed standards like laws, and norms, which are largely sort of self-enforced practices. We all take a guess at the number. We don't drop the F-bomb in this nice, beautiful space, are themselves value neutral. We can use them as tools for justice or injustice, but ultimately, there's a map to self-governance that exists above and beyond rules. And I would say that it involves inquiry, asking questions, self-reflection, understanding yourself, generosity, informed generosity, right? Lucy can only move the football out of your way so many times. Generosity and connected communication. Communication that's designed to be understood and not to win and dominate. So I'll talk about those. So first, my example of why laws are in themselves potentially value neutral and not ends in and of themselves. So here we are in the US Marshal Museum. And the US Marshals enforce our laws. We're a government of laws, not men. It's a great thing. The US Marshals, when they were established, not long after they were established, I guess a few decades, enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. So it was the role of the people who now serve us in many other ways to ensure that if an enslaved person violated by the law by attempting to be a human being and leave and exercise the liberty that you exercise today to make your choices in your life, the law said, go take that person back, right? Later, the US Marshals would accompany James Meredith to Ole Miss and Ruby Bridges to her elementary school to integrate it when the laws that they were enforcing were Supreme Court decisions that said segregation is illegal. It violates the supreme law of the land. Now, the marshals in both cases were acting in pursuance of the law, enforcement of the law, right? Today, we look at the Fugitive Slave Act. I don't think I'm being particularly provocative here when I say we do not look kindly upon the Fugitive Slave Act, which said, the power of our entire federal government will rain down on one human being trying to be free, right? And we look at the civil rights decisions that integrated our colleges and our schools as just laws. Now, I say we in a way that's a bit presumptuous. Unfortunately, about once a year or more, someone puts a noose on the statue of James Meredith at Ole Miss. So my speech got less funny. But so I think we in this room will embrace equal access to our schools as a greater good. So the law in itself and the people charged with enforcing the law isn't in itself something we can look to as a blueprint for justice necessarily. One of my favorite quotations from a Supreme Court case about this comes from the 2003 case Lawrence v. Texas. Justice Kennedy is retired, but he wrote this decision. Had those who drew and ratified the due process clauses of the 5th or the 14th Amendment known the components of liberty in its manifold possibilities, they might have been more specific. They did not presume to have this insight. They knew that times can blind us to certain truths, and later generations can see that laws once thought necessary and proper, in fact, serve only to oppress. As the Constitution endures, persons in every generation can invoke its principles in their own search for greater freedom. I always cry when I read that. I got through it. All right, and that sounds really dangerous, right? If each of us decides which laws are any good, we might become very unsafe. So what do we do? I would argue we understand the rules that bind each of our communities and each actor in a speaking and listening context, and understand where those rules come from and what they say. Recommend that we engage in self-reflection. Who am I in relation to these laws? Do I agree with them because they benefit me? Am I defending them because I haven't thought about it? We listen and read with a mindset of informed generosity. You ever heard of the presumption of innocence? So what's the presumption of innocence? What does that mean? Does that mean nobody ever did a crime? Innocent till proven guilty. It's a presumption. It means when I walk into this room as a juror, I see this accused person before me as innocent, and it must be proven otherwise. I would like to introduce an idea of a presumption, a rebuttable presumption, right? It means you can prove otherwise. A presumption of good faith. That's what I would call informed generosity. Presume that the person trying to talk to you wants some of the things in life that you want. Maybe wants a good society, whatever that means. Presume that they're not trolling. How many of you have ever been on the internet? Ever run across a troll? So people do troll, right? That's why it's informed generosity, right? But generosity, imagine how your blood pressure would be if you approached every conversation, imagining that the person talking to you is hoping to do the right thing. Might not be very good at it. They might be very short on information. But imagine if you approached each other like you were trying to do the right thing. And communicate to be understood rather than dominating. So I want to apply this to something that it feels to me, as somebody who's in the think and teach and learn and business for a living, shouldn't be contentious, but like everything's political if you decide it is, right? Anything becomes a political issue when some political actor decides it is. It's actually really tough on us, I think, when people in the political space decide something that we might not have thought was political is then, because it takes it off the table for us to be able to engage with it as rationally and dispassionately as we'd like to. But the one that I'm going to pick is coronavirus, right? Which hasn't come here yet, and likely will, because it's a virus and it doesn't, respect borders or, it's, of course, the girl who accidentally went to Oklahoma just has a bit of respect for the universe's capacity for chaos. So coronavirus transmission is actually within our control. It's an odd thing. So science tells you like how germs spread, right? But human societies dictate how quickly they spread. Our behaviors relative to each other dictate whether there will be community infections. In other words, the difference between one unfortunate person going to a hospital and a whole bunch of people. And some things are hard to control, like some people live in institutional settings like nursing homes, and those are places that are much more dangerous for infectious disease. But some things are within our control. So how many of you shake hands regularly when you meet someone? What would happen if you didn't? What would they think of you? Would it be a bad idea?
It could be an awkward situation.
It could. Why could it be an awkward situation?
Because many times that's considered a welcoming gesture.
Yeah.
So not, especially if someone were to put their hand out and you don't, that could be off-putting and make them potentially have less respect or be less likely to even listen to what you have to say after that.
Ah, and right, we know, even though I don't want to spend our time together necessarily on the First Amendment, as someone who teaches about the First Amendment, and our students all know this too, right? Speech is more than words, right? Expression. Do I take a knee before a football game? Do I shake your hand or decline to shake your hand? These are statements if they're intended to be statements and are understood to be statements. So why do we shake hands?
Respect and social grace.
Respect.
I think I heard that hundreds of years ago it was an indication that we did not have a sword in the game.
Yeah, actually, yeah. It's, hi, I'm damn good to meet you. I'm not armed. And then subsequently, I mean, what says, it's past Valentine's Day, but next year, give it a try. It's like, you look lovely tonight, and I am not packing. See how it goes. And later, a theory about adding from just a hand clasp, which was like the sort of ancient Greek one. See, I'm not possessing a sword and wielding it. I'm coming in peaceful engagement and not violent engagement. One theory about adding the shake in medieval times is that this would like dislodge any little knives that you've actually got up your sleeve, which is where that up your sleeve language even comes from. Right? So this is something that's evolved from a time when you might need to, now I don't know what your staff meetings are like, mine don't tend to rise to the level of like, can we all just check whether we're armed, but exam period gets a little dicier. But this is a gesture that's an old one, that some of us, know its provenance, and maybe it matters. It doesn't mean that anymore, hi, I'm not armed, and in fact, you might shake someone's hand while wearing a holstered weapon and that's visible or not. So it's not a guarantee that you're not armed anymore. It doesn't mean that at all. And declining to do so is not cool. And as our colleague said, right, it could actually be read as an expression of disrespect. So here's my question. What if you knew that making a decision not to shake hands for some specified amount of time would actually help save lives? Would you do it? You're skeptical. It's hard. What's hard? It is hard, and that's good. What would be hard about that?
I would do it, but I know a lot of people that would not do it.
So, do you feel like you have a sense of their perspective there, like why they might not?
I'm just thinking of things like the flu vaccine. People don't get it because they have a lot of other feelings about it, even though it does save lives. So, in that sense, I equated it to the handshake.
So for the flu vaccine, there's a few things. I mean, there's misinformation about the vaccine, that it might harm you. And one of the things that's fun in my classes at AU is I teach students about the psychology of debunking and misinformation, and it's really cool stuff. One thing is that our brains are wired to be really hard to correct. All of us with spouses or children knew that, but I can tell you the science confirms it. Right, science is with you. Those little aren't. See, the F word is really useful. You're gonna be sorry and want us to use it. So that's one reason. And then with vaccines, it can be uncomfortable. You might fear it. Why else might it be hard to be the person who says, like, I'm making the call, no more handshakes? Yeah.
Well, this isn't a direct response, but a few days ago, someone who had a cold, but not the coronavirus, said I'm contagious and gave an air handshake. I understood it, but it felt weird in a way. It didn't feel very. Intellectually I got it, and it's like I care about you. I'm gonna in two ways. I'm going to greet you and also protect you. But it just seemed awkward.
Well, it's alien, something that we always do. It's different. Any other reasons it might be hard?
It breaks the norm. It breaks the, what societal expectations are for within amongst most Americans. That the handshake is something you're supposed to do. So to suddenly say, I'm not going to, you're now going, this hand going upstream.
It violates a norm that we all agree to. And there's science to this too. When you take something that's commonly accepted and you say, this might harm, people grow defensive. Human beings have an enormously hard time distinguishing between critiques of our actions and critiques of ourselves, right? Think about a time someone said to you, that memo doesn't look like what it needed to for our customer. Or, your approach to that meeting isn't going to work, for the next one. And you felt attacked. Have you ever felt attacked when someone criticizes your work? Yeah. And there's a lot of psychological research to show that having our ideas or practices questioned reads to us little lizards. We're basically just lizards with better clothes. I don't know. There's probably like an Instagram account of some lizard in a tux who's just extraordinarily dapper, but most of us look great tonight, right? We actually don't have the capacity as human beings to distinguish between threats to our values and threats to our physical being. We experience them the same, right? Which is why you get hashtag not all men, right? So it is hard to be the person who says, I'm not going to shake hands. Because implicit in I'm not going to shake hands is shaking hands hurts. And implicit in shaking hands hurts is you, person I'm engaging in, who might have just shook hands with that next person, 2 minutes before we met, are doing it wrong and hurting people. And that is incredibly hard. So we're actually going to be faced with an interesting problem where shaking hands is in fact a value-neutral practice, right? Have any of you been to a country or a place where they do something other than shake hands in greeting? So what's another version of it that might be used? Kiss on the cheek, which is another good infectious thing. Bowing to each other, which is the world is divided into huggers and non-huggers, and only non-huggers know it. And it is our burden to bear. I would love to live in a bow society. That sounds fantastic. It's be over there, right? So it's not like people who shake hands are better than people who don't shake hands, but it is our standard. But it's untethered to justice. Now, what if you had an immunosuppressed child or older person at home in your care? So someone going through chemotherapy, I don't know if people have been reading up on the virus, but it's actually not super dangerous to healthy younger people, but it is much more dangerous to older people in terms of if you're infected. So what if your beloved grandmother was at home waiting for you here? You should have brought her, but that's rude of you. But she had something better to do. She was watching a cool TV show, and she thinks you're the less cool one, which is, if she were at home, would it be an easier call to say, okay, I'm not shaking hands anymore? How would you feel if you made that call because your grandmother was at home and you were judged? You'd feel defensive? Would it be hard to say, hey, my grandmother's at home, I really fear for her well-being? You'd be able to say it out loud. Why? justification for your actions. And you'd probably maybe even feel a little bit, I would, okay, you're probably nicer than me. I would feel a little superior in that moment. It's like, you're just some, square, shallow, handshaking effer, and I am a grandma-loving good person, right? I just saved grandma, you little jerk, right? I feel pretty good. Now you don't have grandma at home. You just know that community infection is bad, and if we all, at a certain point, following the lead of public health experts on what's going on in our communities locally, made a decision at a certain point to change the way that we get into physical contact with people, somebody, somewhere, could be spared a serious illness. Is it still just as easy to justify in that conversation with someone? I'm seeing you're looking like it would be harder. Why would it be harder?
Yeah, because it's a little more attenuated. The grandmother makes a better story. The other one is broader, and it's less, I'm less able to point to something that I'm actually doing by actual purpose.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of things to draw out here. One is that we know that in making public policy, right, and our friend who's from our congressman's office knows this, in making public policy, nothing works better than a story. And if you need to bring some imperative to his office, which I recommend you do 3 or 4 times a week because he wants to see you, have a constituent who's it's actually happened to. That's what I always learned as a lobbyist. I need someone in my district this actually affects. And in the early 2000s, there were a number of Congress people who would say with a straight, no pun intended face, there's no gay people in my district. And be like, have you met your nephew? Okay. There sure are. Oh, you're gonna love the 2000s, sir. Right? So you want to bring a story. It's more compelling. Another thing that we know is that stories don't always make the best public policy either, right? We deploy the stories we want to deploy. So I worked for many years on a law called the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which is a law that makes a federal offense and to commit violent crimes motivated by bias, and it was named for 2 men who were the victims of bias-motivated murders. So that their lives helped this law pass feels good. But you can imagine, if someone is, walking down Garrison Street and, slips on a tomato and we want to and dies and we all ban tomatoes, it's not, that's not making good public policy. So one thing we know is that stories make good public policy, and if you want to make change in your community, bring a real human personal story to the foreground. It's an easy way to communicate. The other thing we know is that when we want to violate norms, people tend to implicitly apply a rebuttable presumption that the norm must be upheld, as opposed to what I would argue would be more just, a rebuttable presumption that attempts to pursue justice are worth it. It would be good if we didn't have to prove that there was a very specific person we were trying to save when attempting to make change in our shared public interests. Could be anybody's grandmother we come in contact with by way of the public facilities that we use and restaurants and water fountains and handrails. Anybody's grandmother, right? I was very close with my grandmother, and I wear her watch always when I'm working, and she wanted to go to college and couldn't. This is such an American story, right? She was an immigrant. It was the Depression. She had to help, make money so that her younger sisters could eat and stuff. And so I teach in college and wrote a book about doing well in college, and I never do a talk without wearing, her watch. So for me, it's very real, but everybody's grandmother is worth it, right? To me. If we can reflect with each other with generosity, the person who's doing something out of the usual here that makes me feel judged might be attempting to pursue justice. And then I think reflect deeply on why we should need for their attempt to pursue justice to be tied closely to them. I think that's worth it for our discourse. So before I move to questions and answers and you telling me how wrong I am, which is always the fun part. So that's what I think civil discourse is. It's pursuing truth. It's approaching one another with a basic rebuttable presumption that the person trying to connect with me has a reason that I might be able to value if I listened. It's about listening and talking. Those of us in the room who are teachers struggle to try and find ways to get our students becoming great listeners, because that's like 90% of education, and talking is not as much. And it's each of our responsibility. Ultimately, it's lonely being the norm breaker who says, I might need to stop shaking hands, or more notably, I might have to sit at that lunch counter. It's lonely, but it's leadership, and it's our responsibility to decide when that's happening through inquiry and listening. Leslie actually also asked me to just tell you what I thought civil discourse was not, what productive discourse is not. So it's never lying. I don't believe in the hashtag all ideas matter approach. It's been said that civility just means you state any idea respectfully, right? I don't think that's true. When my students tell me that, I'll go, okay, well, I respectfully am quite certain the Holocaust didn't happen, and have this very professional tone about it because I'm so sure, because I'm pretty sure I'm gonna win out over the Jews who've manipulated you into thinking this thing happened. And my students' jaws drop, and I'm the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, so that, I'm obviously not believing that. But right, there are some ideas, it doesn't matter what your tone is, they're garbage. I was gonna make like University of Oklahoma is better than Arkansas or something, that some sport or other. That didn't work, okay. Right. It's not mere politeness, because there's nothing polite about sitting at that lunch counter. There's nothing polite about insisting that you can take your place in your school in New Orleans like Ruby Bridges did, or your place at Ole Miss like James Meredith did. There's nothing polite about that. There's nothing particularly polite about being the U.S. Marshal, elbowing their way through people so that those people could get their education. There's nothing polite about it. It's just. Right? It's not about telling people who they are. If you take away one thing from this other than deep curiosity about the number of cubic centimeters in this room so you can figure out the jelly bean thing, which if anybody does, I'll send you a project on civil discourse mug or something. If you take away one thing, it's try sticking to I statements for a few days. Just drop the pronoun you, drop them. Speak only from your own experience for a few days. Don't characterize others, and see how it goes. And every time you're tempted to describe other people, pose a question instead. And finally, civil discourse isn't an exercise in martyrdom. Some of you are getting ready to go off to college next year, and one of the ideas that you'll be exposed to and asked actually to maybe kind of enforce is that the best people are thick-skinned about hearing just about anything. And people who aren't as good at college and community and tough questions get upset. And I'm here to tell you, I don't think that's right. I think if you're the person who gets less upset, it probably just means you have less skin in the game. It's just not you whose humanity's on the chopping block. So think about why someone else might be, and imagine your communication as a desire to be understood, not to win, not to perform, not to seek the approval of others and secure the approval of the majority, to be truly understood by all the people in the room. Because if that's your communications goal, it becomes impossible, actually, to be rude. Because as some of us said, it'll shut people down. And then you won't get the opportunity to be understood. So that's what I think it's all about as someone who goes around as an expert in humility. And I thank you. And I hope that if you have questions or comments or jelly bean insights, you'll share them now.
I have a question. There's a great quote by Voltaire that I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to my death your right to say it.
Yeah. And
now today, it's ad hominem, it's labeling, it's a substitution for our fact-based discussion of issues and outcomes. What's your take on labeling and ad hominem?
So the Voltaire quote illustrates the limitations and purpose of the First Amendment. Right? The First Amendment says that the KKK gets to march, and the Nazis, and the Fred Phelps, God hates fags people, those are all literal, real Supreme Court cases, right? Our First Amendment, our Constitution, because it's deeply suspicious of government authority, no offense to the law enforcement here, but we don't trust government authority to decide what ideas are any good, right? Says, I will defend your right to say it, yes. And it's not a blueprint for how to live. The question of what the government or some authority can stop us from saying isn't often a very complex question. But we're supposed to be people living in a community solving problems together. So what's worth saying is a completely different question. On the space of speech on college campuses where there are been these clashes, someone wants to invite this guy Milo who takes a dim view of like Muslims and feminists and gravity and photosynthesis and all sorts of stuff. There's this real focus on that part of your right to say it, which is accurate as a question of, do the universities have the right to say, no, you can't do this, right? But then the question of what does a person contribute into a community when they're using their voice is completely unrelated to this question of whether the authorities can punish and censor them. And that involves us all being the architects of our own decisions of how to personally engage in a community. I think we've been done a great disservice, actually, by a lot of the people at the front lines of this battle because they've mistaken the burdens of our system of free speech with its blessings. The KKK is a burden of being free. It's not a bonus. We are free because we've figured out a way to make it possible for everyone to speak, not because these total garbage terrorists are included in that everybody. So ultimately it's not super controversial to say the KKK are a bunch of terrorists, so we're all good, okay, right? Okay, just checking. Love to read a room. Right, so I think when someone tells you hey, you're being anti-American and saying I don't like this speech, the First Amendment isn't about whether ideas are any good. It's about mistrusting government authority with our freedom. That's all. The rest is up to us, and we gotta be grown-ups and do the right thing. Other thoughts? We play a game in my classes, my professor is full of, and it's where I invite for a whole day of my first year class where we do nothing but trash this one article I wrote, and the students, it's so cathartic for them. So you're welcome to trash it. You're completely wrong. Any other thoughts? People just want beer to go home, popcorn, jelly beans.
When you were talking about using the stories for creating public policy and the coronavirus examples, thing that was running through my mind with that as well, because in my previous career I was a health educator, was in the mid to late 80s when HIV, and how people were using those same, using stories to create policy that was excluding people out of fear of something being transmitted that we didn't know about, but they're still trying to create public policy based on hearsay stories.
Yeah, and the thing is that stories are like knives and religion and the First Amendment. They can be used for good and they can be used for chaos. So the law that authorizes the funding to protect our public health from HIV and AIDS is still named for a child who Brian White, right, who contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion.
But then they later made laws that if you knowingly transmit it.
Yeah, so we deploy personal stories sometimes for benefit, sometimes for chaos. Ultimately, there are other ways to make good public policy, but we know there's, two separate things, right? There's doing the right thing and there's winning. The easiest way to win, and it's still hard, it took us like 10 years to pass Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Act. The easiest way to win is with real personal stories, right? But that's not the easiest way to find out what would be right for your community, what works, for example. It's provocative to say this, in a room that includes high school students, but surviving a horrific act of violence in your high school doesn't make you more aware than other people what would prevent gun violence. Only inquiry can do that.
I have another question for you. When Walter Cronkite got on national TV in the late 60s, he said that he had been to Vietnam and he couldn't see a way that he could win. All of America's attitudes changed, or much of America's attitudes changed, because the media was perceived as being fair and reasonable and not biased at that time. So now, you have all these media outlets that feed into a different part of the spectrum from left to center to right. And people tend to listen to what reinforces their pre-existing views.
Correct.
And usurps people's ability to hear objective information and make a discriminating analytical decision themselves. What role does that play?
I think it does play a role, and I'll say though that one step in that is that there was a conscious decision in the late 60s where some actors determined that undermining public trust in certain institutions, particularly government, higher education, and media, would benefit corporate interests, and that has been a highly funded, decades-long, largely successful enterprise that gets us where we are today. So it's nice to be in a museum where we respect history, right? We respect cause and effect. So what can we do, though? It's nice when, it's nice when we feel like we have power to make things better. So I would argue that education on informational literacy is the key to governing ourselves in our best interest. Everybody should be able to do 4 things. 1, you should be able to identify the contours of the problem that you're considering, beginning with a question, what would I need to know to make an informed decision about this? Secondly, you should have skills to pursue credible, useful, real, valid information to answer those questions. Thirdly, you should be able to curate that information to ensure its relevance, its reliability, its currency. And fourth, you should know how to communicate in a manner that deploys that information responsibly, which is something I've almost never seen a course that teaches that. So an example of deploying information responsibly, my favorite one would be People saying, you know, Hitler took guns away from the Jews. So, obviously, gun control is like kind of a Nazi vibe. Right, there's actually a lot of steps between those things. But if you can do those 4 things, identify what do I need to know, which requires starting with I don't know and a degree of humility. Have some skills in finding it. Have some skills in vetting what you've found. And understand the strengths and limitations of the data that you want to deploy to be understood. You're gonna do okay. And then deploy your data to be understood in conversation, again, not necessarily to win.
So do you think we've progressed or regressed in that thought process of the decision model? And being a city director, I have a lot of people who come up and say, well, I feel this way. And my question to them is, well, why do you feel that way? And what information do you have that substantiates the way you feel? And they're stumped. But they go home and they get on social media and they tell 5 who tells 5 who tells 5 how terrible I am or one of my fellow directors because we question them about how they feel or the information that they provided. So it seems to me that this vocal majority on Facebook is less relevant to that decision model now than it was maybe a decade or 2 ago.
Well, I think people have the capacity to utilize those channels to elevate the heat of discussions and bring people into discussions very rapidly and passionately. So in that way, you know, that's regression. So one thing I do know about, and this comes from some of the science of debunking misinformation and also some of the science of agreement, is that if you ask people how their preferred choice will work, and you ask them to explain it. So how will, you know, free parking only for dentists on Wednesdays work in Fort Smith, doctor, right? If you ask them how their approach will work and you ask them to really walk you through it, but you ask them in good faith, not on the attack, it actually makes people more ready to be skeptical of their initial position.
Yeah, it's really not the one-on-one that's the problem. It's the one person who hears something they want to hear that goes back and then blows it up on Twitter or social media and Facebook, and then it comes back in a media quote that the media is quoting sources from Facebook that, you know, we don't have a reliable source from Facebook. We've got this information. Are you kidding me? And it's super frustrating.
It's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
And I'm not minimizing that. I think, you know, being able to, that's part of the value of the face-to-face is making sure that you can create a conversation that is also on the record.
In the use of social media, it does allow individuals to step out of their comfort zone, if you will, and it gives a universality, if you will, to a comment. And I'll use a specific story of a UAFS student and his situation with his hair and his interaction with the coach. When that was brought to the community and it was raised, it made it national headline, if you will. But when you look at personal stories versus social media, how can you use those experiences to truly develop policy that impacts a community? Because maybe one-off, people that did not hide behind a keyboard said, you know what, I feel this way, but I'm not going to say it. I feel that way, but I'm not going to say it because it's not acceptable in the community to say these things. But when someone brings it out, it allows people to say, you know, that did happen to me. That did happen to me. So what would be your recommendation when something is brought out, as unfortunate as it may be to some, to try to make positive change or have that true civil discourse?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you asked that. So we have a saying in disability advocacy, nothing about us without us. public policy is generally made about disabled people without input, like all the time, by parents, by caregivers. Nothing about us without us. That's a rule that should apply to public policy always. Public policy about children, about veterans, about anybody, about anything. And the earth can't weigh in on its own behalf, so we have to be proxies, but nothing about some community without them. At the point that something has happened that gets members, particularly of a community that doesn't usually have a voice or a space to communicate, talking, that is a gift. Nobody can make good public policy on behalf of people, sort of in patronage of them, condescension toward them, without them at the table. And one of the things I mentioned that I think is missing from the civility model is that the civility model, if there's a certain appropriate way to do things, leaves a lot of people out of the table. And it's people who have an enormous stake in what our government does, how our society is run. So imagine if your housing wasn't secure and you didn't have ready access to bathing facilities, and you wanted to come to this talk because you were misinformed that I was going to give you useful stuff to go home with and you could be a great advocate coming from it. But you wouldn't come if you didn't have access to those bathing facilities and you know you were going to go to this very nice formal place with these very well-heeled people, all of whom have access to showers and hygiene products and maybe aren't embarrassed of their teeth. You're not going to be in this conversation, right? And who has more skin in the game than that person who keeps losing her housing, right? She needs to be at the table. So in these moments when the anger bubbles up and people who have been silent, for whom there isn't a news network that really is saying that homeless people or housing insecure people are the center of the focus, right? Because they're not a market who's spending money on advertisers. When those people are speaking up because of something, that's a moment where the humility to say, what I need to do now in pursuit of justice is give these people the microphone and hear them however they choose to engage. Because I don't think you can make good public policy ignoring the people who are affected most by it.
I have one final question. I was walking through the airport yesterday, and nobody was looking up. Everybody was on their handheld device. There's a commercial on TV where a bunch of kids are sitting around a table, and they're trying to decide where to eat lunch, and they're communicating by text message. I wonder if we're losing the skill set necessary to engage in meaningful conversation about issues. How do we deal with that in today's electronic age?
Let's do an exercise. Let's practice generosity. Who can come up with some actually really positive things that could be going on behind those screens?
Engagement. My students work terribly hard at our college. They work a lot. They also, some live on campus, most live off campus. Connections are hard, and so they're connecting. They're engaging with things. And one thing I think that I really wanted to bring up about my mother, who's almost 91, she told a lady where she lived, she lives at an independent living thing, just for our purposes. A lady was saying that she was concerned about that, because it is a concern. But my mother said, when's the last time that you engaged your grandson? What is he interested in? What should you say to him? How could you talk to him? She was a 6th grade teacher here for 40 years. And I don't know how long she's ever talked to children, it's hard to say. But I think they engage.
So I'm not saying, there are reasons to be worried about how much people are engaging on screens, things with attention deficit, all that. But there are actually reasons to celebrate. So when I was working in American Association of People with Disabilities, we give a couple of awards to disability leaders every year. And the person who came up with this organization, Able Gamers, which makes adaptive video game technology, was getting a civil rights award because there are tons and tons of disabled people for whom interactive, socially connected video games are actually the first fully accessible social space they've had. And it's miraculous and excellent. So I would say, I think I have a 10th grader and I have a bunch of students. I have 70, 18 to 22-year-olds a semester coming my way. So I am familiar with the screens thing. But I'm thinking, like, I wouldn't have communicated with my son while I'm visiting here if my face hadn't been in my phone. And he, had to go home from school sick today and was pretty bummed about it. And texting made me be able to parent. So you might have seen me doing that if you had seen me walking along from the excellent Fort Smith Coffee Company that I love to my hotel room, and I would have looked like that girl, but I was parenting. So, it's complicated. One last one.
Still on the jelly bean thing.
Good. I like tenacity.
I already figured it out. It's twice as many as half.
Twice as many as half. I like it. That's probably true. I think that's a wrap, folks. Thank you for being here.
Folks, thank you so very much for coming this evening. If you want to stick around for a little bit and see the museum, if you haven't been through it yet, please feel free to do that. And remember that next month, if I can pull up that information, April 6th, Dr. Malcolm Glover from the Arkansas Public Administration Consortium and Clinton School of Public Service will be talking to us. Please spread the word. I think that this year in particular is a year that we should all just stop and focus on how to have discussions that are meaningful. And with that, I say again, thank you so much for coming. Please say hello to one of the staff members in the back on your way out and thank them because we wouldn't be able to do this without them. Thank you.